Okay, good. Let's pull up the first lecture. So these lectures are based primarily for my AP class, so there's a lot more information than you guys actually need. So I'm going to zip through stuff and just, if you need it, I'll remind you. But primarily, when we first came to America, we came in 1607. So the first thing you guys should note is that when we came to America, we first came in 1607, and we landed in Jamestown. You guys might be familiar with the story of Jamestown. And Jamestown becomes the foundation of American colonies by the British. And at Jamestown, what ended up happening was that this was probably the worst place that we could have established a colony, because it was swamp infested, there were mosquitoes, and everyone that attended were gentlemen. They weren't workers, they weren't laborers, they were there just to look for gold, and they had servants. Oh, and there were no women. And so what ended up happening here at Jamestown is that in their first winter, of the 135 that attended, only 38 survived. Primarily because they forgot to build homes, they didn't realize they probably should stock up on food, and 38 survived that first year, which is horrible. I mean, that's a horrible rate. Luckily, the only reason why those 38 survived is because of this guy, the hero of Jamestown. Do you guys know the hero of Jamestown?
Captain Smith?
Captain John Smith. So Captain John Smith is a hero of Jamestown because in order to prevent the colony from collapsing, he introduces military rule. He says, famously, "He who shall not work shall not eat." So if you guys are going to laze about and just sit there and not do your work, well then fine, you're going to starve to death. But if you want to survive, then he who shall not work shall not eat. And that gets them through that first winter, luckily, and they survive, and then the English ship arrives with 400 people, and they replenish this colony again, and they're going to thrive again. Unfortunately, John Smith has to go home because he's injured. He takes a nap by a campfire, and he has his gunpowder on his belt, and the gunpowder actually accidentally ignites, and he sets himself on fire. And so as a result, he's forced to go home, and the colony's left without a leader again, at least a good leader. And so the colony forgets everything that Captain John Smith taught them, and then they forget to, have food. They forget to build enough shelter. And after that second winter, called starving time, of those 460 survive. And so again, it's a horrible, horrible condition for the first 2 years of Jamestown. Again, we call that time period starving time. In fact, they got so hungry that they began to boil their belts, shoes, and hats because of that beaver fur. It still had some protein in it. So they're literally eating their clothes because they had nothing left to eat. They were digging in the ground looking for worms, but there was nothing. Now, people will tell you they engage in cannibalism, but that did not happen. There was no cannibalism at the early Jamestown, but it was bad. It was not good. So eventually they survive, and the person that saves them is a guy named Lord Delaware, who we eventually named the state of Delaware after. But Delaware comes and saves them. He reinstitutes military rule, and that's how we establish Virginia as a first successful colony. Lord Delaware. Also, fun fact, John Smith did not marry Pocahontas, despite what Disney may tell you. That is a complete fictitious lie, because Captain John Smith was 28 when he met Pocahontas, who did save him when he was captured by the Powhatan Indians, but she was 14, and so the suggestion that they got married is not correct or appropriate. Eventually, Jamestown does grow. They build fort walls. It's pretty impressive. They become pretty successful overall. And they begin to grow. And one of the major reasons why Jamestown begins to become pretty successful is they introduce a cash crop. Do you guys know what was the first cash crop grown by the colonists? Tobacco. And tobacco is introduced by this man, John Rolfe. John Rolfe, R-O-L-F-E, is the introducer of tobacco to the colonies. And tobacco is actually indigenous to the Americas. We brought it to England, we made it better, and then we grew it back here. And the English had a taste for this sweeter tobacco. And so this tobacco crop will result in plantations, because the problem is tobacco is so bad for the soil that when you grow tobacco on one plot the first year, you can't grow there the second year. You have to keep it fallow. So you have to now expand your farm. And then you still can't grow it on the first one. You drain the second one, so you have to expand your farm even further the third year. And so what you see emerge because of the tobacco crop is, one, the rise of plantations. Because before, having a small farm is a farm, but when your plantation grows large enough, that becomes a plantation. And only the richest could have plantations, so they could buy all that land. But you have the rise of plantations, and two things happen. Number one, as these farms get larger and larger and larger, who's not okay with that? The small farmers are a little bit frustrated with it, but the Native Americans are much more frustrated because they're taking Native American land. And so you start seeing Native American conflicts. You start seeing Native Americans attack, which you see the beginning of the Powhatan Wars. And the Powhatan Wars are when the Native Americans start realizing maybe we shouldn't let these Americans feel comfortable, or these British feel comfortable. Maybe we should start pushing back because we don't want this to be a trend of them just expanding. So the Powhatan Wars occur, and this is kind of the first Native American and British conflict over land expansion. The British and the Powhatan Indians kind of go back and forth on this, so it just kind of occurs over time. But the other impact of this increase in land demand, or rather increase in plantations, is that as your farm gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you're going to need more workers. And so before we bring in slaves, we introduce something called the Headright system, which introduces a group known as the indentured servants. Are you guys familiar with the indentured servants? Yeah, they're contracted labor. And so indentured servants were actually European or British immigrants that came to America on a 7-year contract. And the idea was, if you're an indentured servant and I'm a landowner, I will pay for you to come to America. I will give you food, shelter, and land. And in exchange, all I ask is you work for me for 7 years. And that was a pretty good deal for both ends. Because the Headright system, again, if I was paying for you to come, I got labor for 7 years, and that's pretty consistent. And if you're an indentured servant, you get to come to America, which is the biggest expense at that time, if you want to come to the Americas, that passage. And so it actually worked out on both sides. And so people argue that this was a great opportunity for a lot of indentured servants. In fact, it was horrible. Most indentured servants were mistreated. After 7 years, they would not be given land or the food or the things that they were promised, and there were very few people actually enforcing it. So it did screw over a lot of people. Eventually, though, the indentured servant class did get frustrated with the lack of respect. They couldn't vote because they weren't free yet. They were considered indentured labor, so they couldn't vote. They were not free men because they were indentured to someone. And so eventually, you start seeing rebellions. They start rebelling and asking for rights. The key rebellion that you will run into in just a second is Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion is the best example of an indentured servant rebellion. And the reason why they rebel is they're demanding more rights. So you guys should be familiar with Bacon's Rebellion. And the reason why they rebelled is, again, they demanded more rights. The reason why they knew they had rights is because these were British citizens. But now the land-owning class is wondering, maybe we shouldn't have indentured servants anymore because they seem to be dangerous. They tend to rebel, and they tend to ask for rights that we're not willing to give them. And so that'll be something that makes them question whether or not they should have indentured servants anymore, and we are going to replace them because they're just too dangerous. In any case, Virginia does grow and becomes fairly successful here, so you can see the change from them being that once just triangle piece to expanding even further. And as the colony grows because of the success of tobacco, they introduce the House of Burgesses. And the House of Burgesses is their House of Congress. It's pretty much the introduction of democracy in 1619. So the democracy comes to America in 1619 with the House of Burgesses. It's self-government. And this is pretty good because unlike all the other colonies, the French colonies, the Spanish colonies, the Americans, or rather the British colonists, they're allowed self-government, which is not the same for the other countries. Interestingly enough, though, the same year that we introduce democracy, we also introduce slavery. So you have this dichotomy in the year 1619 in which slavery and democracy are introduced in the same year, which could be no further polar opposites. And the reason, rather, when we first introduced slaves, they weren't introduced as slaves. They were actually introduced as indentured workers. They were supposed to work for the 7 years, whatever else. But they were introduced by Portuguese slave traders. And so what happened was, when we had them, we were just running them as we would normal indentured servants. But after the 7 years, they weren't asking for their freedom. They weren't demanding to be set free, because it was their understanding when they were brought here by the Portuguese slavers that they were slaves. And we're like, oh, okay, well, let's just see how far this goes. And then they waited and they waited, and they just assumed that these people weren't going to ask for their independence. And some of them did, but most did not. And so they realized, well, hell, let's keep this going. And what they realized was that with indentured servants, you gave them up for 7 years. But for slaves, even though they were more expensive, you kept them for life. And while they were expensive in the short term, the long-term investment was definitely there. But more importantly, the reason why slaves were so economically viable was that, unlike indentured servants, you got to own the children of your slaves. And that meant all you needed was a male and female slave. And so the mere fact that you were allowed to own the slave children and let them be your workers meant that all of a sudden you had a workforce that could regenerate itself, that it could reproduce and continue. And let's say you only had 2 boys, well, then you enter the practice of trading your slaves and saying, oh, what if we got our 2 slaves together and then we'll split the children? I mean, you had this really horrible practice of now breeding slaves as part of the slave trade. But that begins. Again, and we control the slaves through the slave codes. So the slave codes and the Barbados slave codes are what inspires them. But the slave codes, or the Barbados slave codes, will be the policies that govern slaves. Things like you cannot educate slaves, you may not allow them to own weapons, they may not be taught how to read and write, they may not go out at night. What was the other one? Oh yeah, and you own their children. Those are the pretty key ones. But this is how they kept them, docile. And of course, you had to return runaway slaves. That was the other key thing being made down there. In any case, we talked about Bacon's Rebellion already, so I'm not going to go into that one. Another key colony then after Virginia is Maryland. Maryland is another key colony, and Maryland is founded as a religious haven for which Christian group? They're founded as a refuge for Catholics. Very good. So they're founded as a refuge for Catholics, and they promote that idea through something called the Act of Toleration. So the Act of Toleration is one way that they promise religious freedom for all Christians. So this does not include Muslims or atheists or Jews, but it was religious toleration for all Christians. Act of Toleration of 1649. Now, interestingly, my students always ask, because when I introduce this, I say it was religious toleration for all Christians, but not for Jews and Muslims. And they asked, well, what about atheists? And I said, if you're an atheist, they would kill you. There was just not allowed. To believe in nothing was a huge taboo in the early 1700s. And so no one would ever say, oh, I don't believe in anything. Even Thomas Jefferson, he was still a Christian, even though he was a deist Christian. He wasn't a traditional Christian, but he was a deist. We still believe that there was a God, and he did believe in the Bible to some degree. And so it's always interesting to see the significance of religion in early America, and the fact that it's okay to be a Muslim or a Jew. You're not allowed here. But if you're an atheist, we'll kill you on the spot. Because what do you believe in? And so the foundation of just believing in no God at the time was really, really detrimental. And so the kids will say, like, well, would I have been killed back then? Well, do you believe anything? No. Well, then probably they would murder you, because you have no, you're not part of the Judeo-Christian tradition that they're looking for. And so that was pretty significant. In any case, then you have the Carolinas. North Carolina, South Carolina, they were eventually split. You don't have to know too much about that, but the key thing you should note is that South Carolina becomes the most profitable colony in all 13 colonies. South Carolina. And the reason why they become so profitable is they're not growing tobacco. Instead, they're growing something else. You guys know what they're growing that makes them so profitable? Indigo, rice, and sugarcane. Indigo, rice, and sugarcane. So indigo, rice, and sugarcane makes them the most profitable colony, because all these cash crops that they're growing are not grown for consumption, they're grown for export to Europe. And do you guys know why indigo was so valuable?
Like clothes and wine.
Yeah, and it made it the color purple, and the color purple was considered the color of royalty. And the idea was way back when the indigo, you would get indigo by having to deep sea dive into the ocean and get sea snails, and you would crush them to get that purple pigmentation, which was very dangerous and very difficult to do. So to have a plant that can make that same purple pigment and just grow abundantly, and you can now make purple the color of the people who wanted to be royalty, that was hugely profitable. So indigo anyway, and then rice, and then sugarcane. So that's why Charleston becomes very profitable. And then there's Georgia. Georgia becomes the buffer colony. The idea of this being a buffer colony was that it was designed to defend South Carolina from Spanish Florida. It was supposed to defend South Carolina from Spanish Florida, because the Spanish definitely wanted control of South Carolina because of all of the cash crops. And so Georgians were expected to defend South Carolina from any Spanish Florida attack. The people that lived in Georgia were all debtors, and so the idea was, we will forgive you of your debts if you live in Georgia. And that way, your job will be military service for the entirety of your life, but you'll be protecting South Carolina. They weren't allowed to have plantations, they weren't allowed to have slaves, because they wanted them to focus on just military service. The other thing is that they weren't allowed to be Catholic, because the fear is that they might somehow mix with the Spanish Catholics and therefore put religion over government. Eventually that didn't work out so well, because people said, okay, fine, you're forgiving me of my debts, but now I just have to risk my life forever. That's not cool. So eventually they replace it with, you're allowed to have plantations, whatever else. They get rid of those laws, except for you can't be Catholic. That's Georgia. All right, let's move on to the middle colonies. Any questions about the southern colonies so far?
Debtors, meaning could be criminal or...
Yeah, it could be criminal debt, or just they were unable to pay maybe the taxes to their landowners, that kind of thing.
So,
Yeah, just whoever wanted a second chance is really what it came down to. Even some criminals that were arrested for petty crimes, think Jean Valjean, Les Miserables, those kinds of people, they could be given a second chance to come to America and live their life here in a debtor's colony. Unlike Australia, though, which was a debtor's prison, this is more like a, hey, come on down, maybe you can earn your way back into society, that kind of thing. New England colonies. Now, New England colonies were much more influenced by the Puritans. Now, you guys familiar with the Puritans. The basic idea was, during the Reformation, obviously the Catholic Church split because of Martin Luther, who said, you guys aren't doing enough, you guys are lying, you're paying indulgences, whatever else. So one of the people that broke away from the Catholic Church was John Calvin, who created a religion called Calvinism. And people thought, well, that's great. You create this new religion. That's awesome. You're so different from the Catholics. Good for you. Now, another person that broke away from the Catholic Church was King Henry. And King Henry said, I will too break away from the Catholic Church, but not because I think the Catholic Church has horrible fundamental problems. I want to break away from the Catholic Church because I want to divorce this woman so I can have sex with that lady. Right? So ultimately, the Pope denies him a divorce, and he says, fine. He breaks away from the Catholic Church, and he makes himself the head of the Anglican Church. So that's the only change. And so when you look at the Anglican Church compared to the Calvinist Church, the Calvinist Church is fundamentally different from the actual Catholic Church. There's no communion. There is no worship of idols. There is no priest. Whereas in the Anglican Church, they still have a priest, they still have idols, they still have communion. The only change is that there's no Pope. Now it's just the king. So the Anglican Church is pretty much still the Catholic Church, just no Pope. That's the basic idea. And so many of the people in England at the time thought, well, that's great. I'm so happy that you broke away from the Catholic Church, but you haven't made enough change. We would like for you to actually get rid of all that Catholicness in the Anglican Church. So you see the rise of the Puritans. And really what the Puritans wanted to do was just, again, to de-Catholicize the Anglican Church, make it more Protestant. And many people opposed that idea because they were pretty religiously intolerant. They said, you do it our way or no way at all, because they eventually do take power in England, and they persecute everyone. If you're Catholic, you're horrible. If you're Anglican, you're horrible. You have to do it our way. Well, eventually, the Puritans are driven out of power, and then they're forced to leave England. The Puritans are forced to leave England, and they seek religious freedom. You guys know the story. And they come to America. Ironically enough, though, they're seeking religious freedom for themselves. If a Catholic enters their colony, they're like, whoa, 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 this is a colony of religious freedom for us, not religious freedom for you. And so they're definitely hypocritical. They are religiously intolerant, and they only came to America to be able to practice their own brand of religion. So you have that going on. And so they come to America in 1620, and they land at Plymouth Rock, which, by the way, did not happen. Despite what people may tell you, Plymouth Rock is not a real thing. There is no such thing as Plymouth Rock historically. They landed in Plymouth area, and then they moved to another area soon after. And the idea that a boat would land on a rock, that must be a fairly giant rock. Nonetheless, though, there is a rock in Plymouth, Massachusetts, with a giant weird monument around it, and they say this here is Plymouth Rock. No, there is no such thing as Plymouth Rock. But it's a great story to tell, which originated back in the 1880s when a drunk guy in a tavern would be like, oh, I remember my great-great-great-grandfather came to America, and they landed right there on that rock. And that became Plymouth Rock. In fact, they landed here initially, which is nowhere near Plymouth, and then they came to Plymouth thereafter. So if you look, this is the original landing, and then they moved across because this was not very habitable, so they moved across to Plymouth thereafter. So if anything, they landed in Cape Cod, and then they moved across thereafter. Nonetheless, when they land on the Mayflower ship, they signed what becomes known as the Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact is the first document that they signed altogether that was a foundation for self-government. It was pretty much, we are going to practice self-rule, we're going to practice democracy, we're going to make sure that everyone has a voice except for women and children. But yeah, I mean, it was a foundation of government. It's not as complex as a set of laws yet, but it was an agreement that we will work together. Okay, and then we'll develop a government out of that. And so the Mayflower Compact happens. They had the first Thanksgiving. I always mention to my students that Charlie Brown was there, because there was that fun thing. And then I do this whole thing about how the myth versus reality of Thanksgiving. So again, like here they are signing the Mayflower Compact, and I say, is this more realistic or romanticized? And it's really romanticized, because what's a woman doing in that room? That's ridiculous. That would have never happened. And this time they would be somewhere else, not watching over the men signing this very important document. And then there's documents they would read, and we talk about Thanksgiving, and they're like, they didn't have turkey at Thanksgiving. That was not there at all. That's more of a common tradition. And also, it wasn't like they had this wonderful meeting and they invited the Native Americans. It didn't happen that way. What happened was that they were eating a meal like you and I would normally do for dinner, and the Native Americans were out hunting, and they smelled this food because they heard a gun and they heard a gunshot. So they walked over and they're like, "Hey, what's up?" And they're like, "Hey, would you like to eat with us?" That would be like if I was eating pizza in my classroom and my students showed up and they're like, "Oh, first Thanksgiving." That would be the same thing. And so it wasn't like this planned dinner. It was really just a happenstance, like your friend comes over while you're watching TV and you guys decide to order pizza. That was the first Thanksgiving was like. It was great that it happened, but it didn't happen the way that we tell our students. And there was no turkey. In any case, we talk about this myth and reality, which is always cool. Other key colony you guys should know is Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded by this guy, John Winthrop. John Winthrop, John Winthrop, R-O-T-P, John Winthrop is the governor and founder of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and his idea was to make New England, or specifically Massachusetts Bay, which will become inspiring of all of New England, he wanted them to become a very religious society. He believed that everyone should have a covenant with God. The covenant with God is pretty key here. But he believed that everyone should have this relationship or covenant with God. And he said by doing so, we would have this religiously and politically and economically strong society, and we would become a city on a hill, which is an imagery that's used by every president. We want to raise America up to become the city on a hill, which originates all the way back to 1631. But this is a very common imagery. And the idea was we wanted to be a shining example to the world. A beacon on a hill is another way we describe it. But a city upon a hill or a beacon on a hill, we will be a shining example because through religion, we will be this beacon on a hill. Today, Barack Obama says we will do it through human rights and whatever else. Reagan said we will do it through, freedom and democracy. Monroe did it with we will fight against, European civilizations. We will become an example for the world. But we use it over and over again because it's great imagery. Don't worry about this. You don't have to know that so much. Town meetings is important, though. Politically, they were the most democratic of all the colonies because they had town meetings. So while the House of Burgesses in Virginia, maybe only some representatives could vote, but women couldn't, in the town meetings, because these were also local, everyone could voice their opinion. Children could voice their opinion, and women could voice their opinion. They might not be able to vote, but they had a voice. And so town meetings are the most democratic form of government in all of the colonies. And as you can see, based on this map, it is the most central because everything around it is farms and schools and whatever else. But the meeting house shows its significance to that community right in the center. Right there. And if you notice also, compared to a plantation system, you see all these farms right next to each other compared to a plantation where this would be one plantation. So again, you have these towns in the south, or in the north compared to the south. In terms of Puritan lifestyle was very strict, very religious. Most of the time was spent at church or working or spending family time. This is where you see the development of the Protestant work ethic. You work very hard, you focus on providing for your family, you work diligently, efficiently, that kind of stuff. So you see the Protestant work ethic. My favorite story, though, is about how they raised their children. I mean, very patriarchal, but they wanted to make sure that their children were good Puritans. And so we made sure that we broke their spirits and we shamed them into being good citizens. So what we would do is, if a child was prideful, imagine that your child, was playing, or let's say a child got an A on a test. So the child would run home and be like, Mommy, I did so well on my test. And the mother would say, how dare you? Did you run screaming through the town yelling that you got an A? That's a prideful sin. And so she would beat her child. And so, or, let's say you stole, they would take you out to the public square and, publicly shame you, put in stockades, you'd be like, boo, my child, stole something. So the public would get involved in making sure that they reared the children as a group. Other interesting things, though, is that eventually, obviously, as you have a child, you start to love them, you care for them, and you can't really hurt them or shame them as much because you like those guys. And so you send them away for like 3 or 4 more years once they're 12, and you have another family raise them because they have no inhibition about beating your child. And so that way, by the time they're 16 and considered an adult, they'll be completely shamed into being the type of Puritan that's calm, collect, that they wanted at the time. So raising children was kind of weird. The other thing, though, is that Puritan society, unlike the South that had a lot of single men, Puritan society in New England was mostly married families. No single people were allowed to immigrate. So you had to immigrate in families. Now, obviously, you had single teenagers, whatever else, once they had kids, but you were only allowed to immigrate as a married couple or as families. And the idea was if everyone was supposed to have this covenant with God, they really wanted to avoid promiscuity. They want to avoid affairs and whatever else. So they made sure, if you're immigrating to our colony, you must be married. No single young men or women, because that's going to cause too many problems. They wanted to avoid that. But again, religion was definitely the major focus of the society. There were 2 people that did not like this, though. 2 really good examples of people that dissented. These are called the dissenters. Are first, Roger Williams. Roger Williams was not too happy with the strictness of Puritan religion. He thought that maybe we should relax, that we should share some religious tolerance with other Catholics, Anglicans, whatever else. And the leaders said, no, get out, we don't like you. And so Roger Williams left, and he formed Rhode Island on the foundation of religious toleration. So I always tell the kids, Roger Williams founded Rhode Island for religious toleration, so the R's. The other person that's significant and dissenting against religion is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson. And she believed in something called antinomianism. Antinomianism. So, already, if you were a Puritan, you believed in something called predestination. You guys familiar with predestination? The basic idea is that everything has already been predetermined for you. If you're having a good life, then those are clues that you're probably going to heaven because God likes you. And if you're having a bad life because you're poor, then you're probably predestined to go to hell. And so, like, this already was a class-based religion for the most part. But in any case, Anne Hutchinson said, that's ridiculous. Oh, that's crazy. Don't even listen to, you're still supposed to listen to the preacher, though, because he'll give you clues. But she said, no, that doesn't make any sense. She believed in extreme predestination. And the idea was, do whatever you want, because you were supposed to do that anyway. I mean, there's no control over what you're going to do because it's already predestined. And so if you murdered someone, you were supposed to murder that person. And if you were going to go and be a good person, you're supposed to be a good person. So do whatever you want. Don't worry about what the preachers tell you. Don't worry about man's law or the Bible because they don't have the answers. Trust you, because whatever you're doing is probably what God is saying. And that got her kicked out. But what almost got her killed by the Puritan authority was she said she could talk to God directly. And that's a big no-no, because that creates demagoguery and people might follow her, kind of like Joan of Arc. And so they tell her, either get out or we will kill you, because that's just not okay. That's huge heresy. And so they eventually kick her out. But these are the two people that were not so happy with Puritan religion. They did fight two Native American wars. They fought two wars against Native Americans. The first was the Pequot War, and the second was King Philip's War. Now, these wars can't be about plantation land expansion because they don't have plantations in the north. So the major reason why these wars were fought was because they tried to convert the Native Americans, and they were not okay with that. They said, you're taking away our culture, our livelihoods. I mean, this is who we are. By taking away our traditions and our gods and our animism, you're taking away who we are as a people. And so many of the elders were frustrated that many of the missionaries were going out and converting local natives. And so the Pequot War and King Philip's War began out of frustration. We massacred people on both sides with this one. I mean, Battle of Mystic River, we killed like 350 Native Americans, women and children. And so it was bad on both sides. Don't worry about that one. That's Northern Colonies. Good. Any questions about New England colonies?
So New England colonies started due to
I would say if you're going to compare Southern and New England is mostly religion. The key foundation for New England colonies is religious.
Puritans.
Yeah, the Puritans, whatever else. Because the Puritans, and they founded Plymouth, but other Puritans came after, and they founded Massachusetts Bay, which becomes the foundation for the rest of the region.
So then it's as far as just geography, so it's Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. Is that all?
Yeah.
New England?
Yeah, I'll show you a map right now. So this is the New England colonies right here. Plymouth, as you can see, is this one right here. Eventually, this is Plymouth, but that'll be absorbed in Massachusetts eventually. This will all be Connecticut down here, New Hampshire, and eventually you'll have Maine. So this is pretty much that small corner of America. That'll be the New England colonies. If you look at the giant map, it's a very, very small piece, but they're pretty powerful in that sense. And that's the reason why they can't have plantations either, because the territory is so small and mountainous, like you said. Whereas the southern colonies has a much more larger piece of land.
The two wars
Mhm.
against Indians, were those in regards to a certain colony, or?
Specifically, they were fought against all three or all four,
Okay.
because there was that
Yeah, they
sense.
did a treaty
Yeah, and then
to
they...
work together.
Right, the New England Confederation. Let's see, next up, let's go with the middle colonies. We're done with that one. The middle colonies, you guys have to know that New York was founded by the Duke of York after defeating the Dutch, so that's pretty easy. Not too much you have to know there. You should know that New York is the most diverse colony because New York was originally owned by the Swedish and the Dutch, and then Duke of York took it over, naming it New York. And then when he took it over, he allowed French people to come in, Finnish people, Germans, and so it becomes the most diverse of all the colonies. In fact, the Dutch inspired a lot of our culture, so think of like Easter eggs, waffles, Santa Claus, golf, bowling. All these American traditions are actually Dutch. So, Sinterklaas and Kolf. Then the other middle colony you guys should be aware of is Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn. And this was a colony founded as a refuge for which religious group?
Quakers.
Quakers, or the Society of Friends, as they're officially known as. But the Quakers. The reason why they were called Quakers is that when they would sit in church and they would try to receive inspiration from God, they would quake. And then so that's what they were called Quakers. It was a derivative term for them, but then it's like, yeah, actually, that's not bad. That's actually pretty accurate. And so they're the Quakers, or Society of Friends. And pretty much their religion was very religiously tolerant. They believed in compensating Native Americans for land. They believed that men and women were equal, so they did actually allow women to be preachers. They're the most tolerant of all of the colonies, and so I always argue that they're the hippies of the colonial era. They're the most liberal of them all. They're also pacifists, so they refuse to serve in the military. They become a problem during the American Revolution because people argue you're willing to be taken over because of your pacifist tendencies. And so there is a lot of accusations that maybe the Quakers were sent here to disrupt the eventual American Revolution. But yeah, those are the Quakers. The one thing you should know about the middle colonies is that they're considered the breadbasket of the colonies because they provided all the foodstuffs. And again, put that in perspective, these are the middle colonies right here. The New England colonies are right here. So again, if you're looking at a whole map, it's a very small portion of New England. These are the middle colonies, and then right down here, oops, that's all the southern colonies. But yeah, they provide all the foodstuffs. New England is primarily shipping and trade, and so that's why they don't provide that much food. And again, their territory is too small to be able to provide food for everyone. But the middle colonies are all about providing food and whatnot. Again, like I said, they're the most ethnically and religiously diverse. And let's see here, we talked about all these people. Other key things in the colonial era, 90% of the population, just generally, lived on farms or plantations. So 90% of the population was rural, only 10% was urban at the time because you don't have factories yet. You only have small towns, traders. One of the most famous books at the time was Poor Richard's Almanac, written by Ben Franklin. We get most of our sayings from this today. Things like early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Don't throw stones at your neighbors if your own windows are glass. Early bird catches the worm. Interestingly enough, there was another guy who was writing a book similar to this, and Ben Franklin was not too happy about having competition. And so Ben Franklin was the owner of the Pennsylvania Gazette. He was a newspaper owner, and so he decided that in order to prevent his competitors from take over his business, he printed an obituary saying that the other author had already died. And then the author's like, no, I'm alive, I'm not dead. And people said, man, that's messed up, don't pretend to be a dead guy. And so he was frustrated because everyone believed he was dead and thought he was impersonating a dead man. And so eventually people decided not to buy his book because he thought this one guy was trying to take credit for a dead person, even though it was actually him. And by the time it got cleared up, people had gotten used to Poor Richard's Almanac and not the other man's book. And so Ben Franklin was kind of a terrible person. I like this picture of Ben Franklin. And so there's a pretty cool picture of Ben Franklin fighting Zeus and the key and electricity. That's always fun stuff. Another key person you should be familiar with is Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was a reverend, but he was also kind of a doctor hobbyist, if you can be that. And he created smallpox inoculations. Pretty much most people were dying of smallpox still. Smallpox being the deadliest killer in human history. We still have 2 vials of smallpox now under 24-hour security with machine guns, but it's about 2 baby bottle-sized vials of smallpox still in existence today. They've been completely eradicated except for those 2. It's under 24-hour security in a deep, deep vault with like 30 men with machine guns around it at all times. But we have it just in case it ever spreads, and we have to be able to create antivirals. But it's some pretty serious stuff. The idea was that he would take people infected with smallpox, he would take the pus out of their boils, and he would inject the dead smallpox, the weakened smallpox, into people, intentionally injecting them with a weakened virus. Majority of the people survived this, but they would usually succumb to smallpox first, but they would be able to survive it because the virus was already weakened. And so many people survive smallpox as a result of this, but by first being inflicted with smallpox. I mean, this is what happens today. You get a flu shot, you get sick for a while, and then you are now immune to whatever specific strain you're supposed to be immune from, not forgetting the fact that there are like millions of strains of the flu at any given time. I always think it's preposterous that we pre-make the vaccine for flu based on what we think will be the major strain that year, and we give it to everyone, but that may not be the strain you get afflicted with. So you still get sick because they didn't give you the vaccine for the flu you actually got sick with. And so it's weird.
Last year's version.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, well, this was a really bad one last year. Well, by that time it's already mutated because flu was just really bad. And so it's crazy. There's this movie that's actually short indie documentary or movie that came out. It's called Antiviral, and it's about in the future there's no more disease, and so one of the ways that people do celebrity worship and idling is that they purposely inject themselves with the disease that killed celebrities. Like they're like, oh well, Napoleon died from smallpox, so they inject themselves with the virus in order to see what it was like to be that celebrity at the time that was dying from smallpox, and they'll cure them after. I'm like, that probably would happen, like in the future. That would not be that surprising. People like, I want to die like Michael Jackson, so give me an overdose of OxyContin, and then revive me before I die. I just want to see what it was like to be like the king of pop. Weird. And then John Peter Zenger, Zenger, he is the first person to go to trial, and pretty much not first person to go to trial, let me explain. His trial establishes the freedom of the press. He was a newspaper writer, and he wrote that Governor Cosby of New York was a horrible person, and he was like cheating the people. And so Governor Cosby had him arrested because he didn't like what he was writing. And what the court ruled was, look, you can't arrest him just because he don't like what he's writing. He's allowed to print the truth if it's true. He just can't print lies. And so the example I give is newspapers cannot print that Bill Clinton murdered like 30 people when he was in high school, but they can print that he cheated on his wife. That's okay. You may not like it, but you're allowed to print it because you have freedom of the press. But you can't print just outright lies. That's libelous, and that'll get you in jail. So freedom of the press is established, and that creates a really nice trend in colonial America. Cool there? Okay. Lastly, let's talk about the Great Awakening. This is actually pretty simple. You guys already know this is religion. The first Great Awakening was, again, a religious revival. Religion was declining primarily because people were moving out west, and the last thing you're going to build is a church. You're trying to survive. You're building a home. You're building a farm, whatever else. And so that kind of pulls people away from the church. The other reason why people stop believing in the church is the Salem witch trials. We killed 19 women, we hung 2 men, and we killed 3 dogs as part of this whole Salem witch trials. We imprisoned over 150. And at the very end of this, the church was like, oh, no, there aren't witches. Our bad. We got that one wrong. But the problem is, people began to question, what else did you get wrong? That's a pretty big thing to be wrong about. You killed people and arrested people, and for those, 9, 10 months, we were just scaring the crap out of all women. and you were wrong about it. And so now this questioning begins. If they're wrong about the Salem witch trials, what else are they wrong about? So there's questioning, there's doubt, and people just start moving away from the church, thinking, I'll just do my own religion, and I'll just do whatever I want. And so there's a concern that we're losing people, that piety in America, salvation in America is going away, and so we have to restore that. There's a movement by a lot of preachers that we can't let America's conscience be sent down the drain. And so you have the First Great Awakening, and the First Great Awakening, you see the introduction of new lights, these brand new preachers that are very emotional in their sermons. They're very dramatic, they're very interesting. They don't just simply speak in boring, monotone types of lectures. I mean, they're very exciting. And so these new lights that we call, they begin to preach in forms of preachers called Jeremiads. Oops. And these Jeremiads were considered to be very emotional and very exciting sermons. Jeremiads. And the idea was they would call people out for their sins in the first row, the anxious bench, and they'd be like, "What are your sins? We know that you did it. You cheated on your husband." And people in the audience would just be enthralled by this. And in fact, it was almost like a soap opera. You would come to church because it was exciting. We'd watch, see what would happen. And the sermons were actually also calling people out just for sins in general. No, you are teetering on the brink of hell, and only God can save you in the palm of His hand. One of the most famous sermons by Jonathan Edwards. He's one of the most famous Great Awakening preachers. Jonathan Edwards. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. You're over the precipice of hell, and the only thing holding you back is the hand of God. And at any time, He can pull His hand away and let you cast down into the fires, but He does not, because He loves you. People are like, "Oh my God, that's crazy." And so the New Light preachers, Jonathan Edwards is one really good example of this. The other key example is George Whitefield. George Whitefield is also a significant New Light preacher that travels around, especially to the western areas where there are no churches, and he just opens up shop in the woods, and he says, "All right, guys, let's make some quick benches and let's talk about God." And he tries to bring the western populace back into the church. He says, I know that, trying to protect yourself from Indians is important and farming is important, but salvation is important too. And so he tries to encourage them to build these churches in the West. And so the Great Awakening is pretty significant in kind of reviving religion in America in the early 1630s and 40s. 1730s and 40s. Many people did not like them, though. Many people believed that these new lights were dangerous. They were focusing more on emotion than reason. And so the old lights, these old preachers kind of said, "No, don't listen to them. They were sent here by the devil to trick you into focusing more on emotion when this is supposed to be rational and reasonable and whatever else." And so they were boring, though, and so they got casted out. And these new lights kind of emerge. Okay, that's the colonial era. Are there questions about the colonial era?
So you said it was the Great Awakening took place during the 1730s, 1740s?
Yeah, 1730s and 40s. The one thing that historians now are debating is whether or not there was actually a period known as the First Great Awakening, because it wasn't like from 1710 to like 1732. It really took place over time. It was like a 20, 30, 40-year period. But more traditional historians will still say it was from that 1730s, 1740s time period. More revisionist historians today will argue that maybe it wasn't comprised of such a small period of time, that maybe it was just something that happened. There is no correlation between it all. Because the Great Awakening happened across the entirety of the 13 colonies. But people will say it didn't happen within 20 years, it happened across 100 years, which means that's not a trend. That's just something that happened. But for your purposes, it was a revival of religion in the colonies at the time. Cool. All right. Let's talk about American independence and religion, or American independence. Again, are you guys good? You guys want to take a break, or you guys just want to charge forward?
Charge.
Okay, there we go. I'm skipping the French and Indian War. French-Indian War was the event that took place before the American Revolution. Primarily what happened was that the French, as you can see here, the French originally controlled this territory up here and this territory here. So this was all French territory. What happened was that the French tried to combine their territories, and the British tried to merge west. And so naturally, they came to conflict in this area. After the French-Indian War, the French were kicked out because the British defeated them. And so this war was very expensive. And the British said, colonists, you caused this war. You have to pay us back for it. They're not saying you have to pay for the entire British debt, but they're saying, look, we let you alone for over 150 years. From 1607 until 1763, we just let the colonies do whatever they want, and it was fine. You know, they were profiting, they were taking care of themselves, and England was benefiting from that relationship. But when the colonists started that war with France, and Britain was forced to fight it, all of a sudden it cost the British over $150 million. And they said, we can't let these guys alone anymore. That cost us a lot of money. And so because of the French and Indian War, you'll see the end of what we call, oops, where's my pen? You'll see the end of something called benign neglect. The other term for it's salutary neglect. Benign neglect suggested that the colonists were being ignored by the British, but it was okay. You know, they were benefiting. It's like when your parents work at night, and so you learn to be independent because your parents were always working. You learn to cook and clean, lock the doors, whatever else. Same idea. The British colonists learned to be independent, and the British were cool with that for a while. They benefited. The problem is, because they caused this really expensive war, we could no longer practice benign neglect. Because what if the colonists started another war, and it cost us another $150 million. That's the first reason why this revolution begins. The other thing is, we expect them to pay it back. They have to pay this back because they caused this war. And so the first thing that we do is we pass something called the Proclamation Act of 1763. And what the Proclamation Act said is that the colonists may not move west anymore. Which sucks, because if you look at the yellow on this map here, all of this territory is territory that we won in the French and Indian War. We died for that. We bled for that. And now the British are telling us, you can't have it. You can't expand. Because the fear is that if they continue to expand west, who might they come into contact with? The French are gone, but the Spanish are still there, and who else is still living in pockets all around this territory? Native Americans. And so the concern is, if we move out west, that's going to cause more wars. That's going to cause more conflict. So for the economic reason of saving money, we're going to keep them in this territory. And the colonists were not happy about that. Up until this point, they could expand as far as they wanted. But now the British are telling them no. The colonists are pretty upset. Secondly, the British want to keep closer control of them. So for political reasons, they want to control the colonists. And it's a lot easier to control the colonists if they stay along the coast than it would be if they spread themselves across this region here. So for two reasons, economic cost and then political control is why we passed the Proclamation Act. And again, the colonists are not too pleased about any of this. They're pretty upset. The next act that they passed is the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts said the colonists could only trade with England. Pretty much it took away free trade. Before, the colonists could trade with whomever they wanted. The French, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese. And the colonists were cool with that. They loved that because it benefited their economy. But the British said, wait a minute. You are a British colony, and you should only trade with England because you're only supposed to be benefiting our colony. If you want to trade with Spain, you have to go to England first, pay the tax, and then trade with Spain. Which the British said that's the whole reason why you set you up anyway. But the Americans were frustrated because they lost free trade. And they felt like it was hurting their economy. And then, of course, you have the Sugar Act, where the British said, you know what? You have to also pay back this war. One way we're going to make you pay it back is by paying a sugar tax. So for every ounce of sugar that you buy, you will pay a 3 pence tax, which they're pretty upset about.
Is that on imports or exports?
Imports.
Okay.
Imports. So every time you were importing British sugar, you would have to be able to pay a tax on it. Because the thing is that South Carolina stopped growing its own sugarcane, and they exported that to the British West Indies. So the British West Indies was growing all the sugar, and when we imported it, we had to pay a tax on it. And so a lot of people were pretty upset about it because the British weren't having to pay a tea tax, but a sugar tax, but the Americans were. And so this cartoon, you had the old British hag and the British king drinking tea while the Americans refused to drink the tea in protest. Two other elements added to the Sugar Act were the writs of assistance and the Vice Admiralty Court. So these two policies were injected in the Sugar Act, which said writs of assistance, they could search your property without a warrant. And the reason why was that we were smuggling sugar in order to avoid paying the tax. So the writs of assistance was a search without a warrant. And then the Vice Admiralty Courts was if you were arrested, you would be tried in a military court, not a civilian court. So imagine if the police officer that arrested you was a person that was also going to be your judge. And imagine that he didn't want to look foolish, so he decided to plant evidence on you. And then he said, all right, and I'm also going to be your judge, therefore you don't get a fair trial. So writs of assistance, again, search without a warrant. Vice Admiralty Court is a military court. Unfair military court. Quartering Act, you guys should know. Again, because the colonists protested against the sugar, like, oh, we don't want to pay this. Okay, fine. If you don't want to pay direct tax, then we're going to make you pay this by allowing us to house British troops. So the colonists were forced to house British troops, and the colonists were frustrated with that as well. Said it was a loss of privacy, loss of goods. They had to clothe, feed, house the British soldiers, which they were not too pleased with. The most hated, however, was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was the worst because this was a tax on what? Not just mail, actually. It's all paper documents. All paper. And the idea was to prove that you paid the tax, they would put a stamp on all paper documents. Playing cards, birth certificates, death certificates, receipts, books, newspapers. Anything that was made with paper had to be taxed, which meant who would be affected by this? Printers, everyone. Every single person used paper. If you were poor, you still had to use paper. And so imagine dying and then you had to pay a tax for the death certificate. Having a child and having to pay a tax to get the birth certificate. And so there was a frustration, and it affected everyone. So as a result of the stamp tax, what ends up happening is you have the creation of what becomes known as a Stamp Act Congress. And the Stamp Act Congress emerges in protest of the stamp tax, and they boycott British goods. They decide to boycott British goods until the stamp tax is repealed. And you also see an increase. So again, they protest until the stamp tax is repealed. They're boycotting it. And then you also see the rise of the revolutionary group, the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty will be a group led by Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and their group is designed to try to, again, fight against the British and promote revolution. Let's see if this cable works. It hasn't worked for me in the past. Hold on, let's see if I can play this video for you guys. One of the things that the, what do you call them? One of the things that the, what were these guys? The Sons of Liberty did, in order to get what they wanted, was they would tar and feather the British custom officials, which was one way that they were able to get their way. Do I have it here? Where is it? And so tar and feathering, if you guys remember from like cartoons, is hilarious, but in real life is pretty horrible. Let's see here if I have a copy of it. Yeah, I do. just like to give people a sense of what tar and feathering looks like because people think it's hilarious based on what they see from cartoons, but in reality it's pretty horrible. Hopefully this works. Still no sound. That sucks. Well, I'll bring speakers next time. But the basic idea of tar and feathering is that I'll show you a video what it looks like. I think it's 43. Where is the scene of tar and feathering? Here it is. Curses. So the idea is that when they tar and feather anyone, they would take him up onto the stockades. They would tear off his clothing. Oh, he missed it. So pretty much they would take molten tar and they would pour it all over you. Now imagine like boiling a tire down and then pouring that over you at scalding hot. So imagine like 3rd-degree burns all over your body. And then they would tar, and then they would feather you. And it's tar and feathering. So really, the Sons of Liberty were labeled as terrorists by the British organization because they were just torturing these customs officials. And so cartoons make it seem funny, but it's horrible. I mean, imagine that on your eyelids, your tongue, your body, and that tar hardens. So as you peel the tar off, you're peeling off your skin as well. And so many people were disfigured as a result of tar and feathering. I mean, it was hugely psychologically damaging. And so definitely not here. Samuel Adams saying, like, you know, people are angry and they fight for what is theirs and when their rights and oppressions are being taken away. And Samuel and then John Adams says, so you're telling me that in order to fight for a political principle, we should be able to break the law and hurt people psychologically? This is justified to fight for a political principle? And he's like, maybe not so much. And so, yeah, the Sons of Liberty were kind of nuts, or at least the leaders were fine, but again, the demagoguery and that mobocracy that kind of takes form when the mobs get together, they played on that, but sometimes they got out of control, so not so great. But yeah, have you guys seen the HBO miniseries John Adams? Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's fantastic. They did a great job explaining the presidency and the life of John Adams. I highly recommend it, and there are clips from it that can be used relevant, like that one, throughout your classes, which would be cool. Here's on Paul Revere, Sons of Liberty. Yeah, I actually noticed recently there's been a lot of just like historical jokes on commercials and television, like Paul Revere on that commercial, like he gets on a cell phone, yeah, they're coming, the British, and he goes back to playing charades. And then there's a Google commercial about using Google and how a girl wakes up and tells her mom, it's dress up as a President Day, and she goes to school as Martin Van Buren. But like the mom has to make her look like Martin Van Buren. It's pretty funny. So again, you have a lot of historical jokes again. Other acts you should know. Well, the Boston Massacre obviously happened. That was kind of bad. The Tea Act you guys probably already know, and it results in the Boston Tea Party, so that's bad. And then the Coercive Act. So this one you should know. The Boston Tea Party cost the British over $100 million. They dumped all that tea in the Boston Harbor, and it was expensive. And so as a result, the British responded with the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. And pretty much these acts did 3 things. What did it do? I'm drawing a blank. The 3 things that it did was that it closed Boston Port until they repaid the tax. It shut down Massachusetts government. I really just know those 2, not a third one. But it shut down Boston Port, and it shut down Massachusetts government, saying you guys are unable to take care of your own people. Oh yeah, and it declared martial law in Boston. So the British decided to take over Boston directly. And so that was not good. And because of all of this, this becomes really the beginning of the American Revolution. But yeah, the colonists were kind of at fault here. That was their bad. Good. Okay, let's move on to the war itself. Where are we? That's 2. We did that one. We did that one. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, now that we've kind of taken Boston and the British have taken it over and they no longer have freedoms and whatever else, the colonists decide to meet at the First Continental Congress. And the idea here is they need to discuss, okay, so what is our response going to be? Are we going to join together and side with the Massachusetts, or is this their bad and we just let them do whatever they want because they did this? You know, Massachusetts is responsible. Should we stand up for them? And so the colonists meet again at the First Continental Congress, and they're going to discuss what their response should be. They're led by John Hancock, who's president at the time. And while they're deciding, they decide, well, do we want independence? And they say, no independence. All we want are our rights restored. So they never wanted independence initially. They actually just wanted, look, we will end all of this if they just give us our rights. Let us be independent, let us self-govern, and we will be loyal subjects to the British Crown. All we want is self-government. That's all we want. Well, between these negotiations and eventual independence, what happens is the first battle of Lexington and Concord. And so now blood is shed, and it's going to be really hard to turn back from this war now that people have died. And so war does break out at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and this is the first battle of the American Revolution. Of course, you have the famous ride of Paul Revere, who makes his beeline all the way to Lexington and Concord, who surprisingly looks a lot like Jack Black. The other thing is that now people know the story. The British are coming. The British are coming. Fun fact: he never said that. Nelson never yelled it. One, they're British. They're all British. They're all British colonists. So they wouldn't say the British are coming. That wouldn't make any sense. If anything, he said either the Redcoats are coming, or the regulars are coming. The regulars are meaning the regular army, not the local militias. Secondly, he wouldn't be screaming that throughout Boston because there are British soldiers everywhere. So he'd be the worst spy in the world if he just charged saying, they're here. So he definitely did not do that. But he did charge quietly through the night. He did not make the midnight ride by himself. He was joined by Prescott and Dawes. And then they eventually make the rest of the way. Paul Revere does not finish his ride because he stops by a tavern and he drinks a little bit because he's tired, and he starts bragging about what he's been doing. And there were British soldiers there that did arrest him, and so therefore he does not finish the midnight ride. Prescott and Dawes are the ones that eventually warned Lexington and Concord about all that event. But the reason why we do Paul Revere's midnight ride is because Henry Wadsworth Longfellow thought his name just sounded better for that midnight ride poem. So a lot of creative license was taken with that. In any case, the Lexington and Concord today debate on where the first bullet was fired. Like, oh no, they killed the first people in Lexington. Oh, it was Concord. It doesn't matter. So we just call it Battle of Lexington and Concord. In any case, because of that, the Second Continental Congress is convened, thinking, holy crap, people have just been shot. So they must decide, well, what are we going to do? And they decide, well, the first thing we probably should do is first send an olive branch petition. The olive branch petition was sent to the king. And the idea was they still wanted to end the war peacefully. They weren't asking for independence. They said, King, if you are willing to end this war, then so are we, and we will still remain loyal subjects. So even right before the Declaration of Independence, we were still asking for just rights. We weren't asking for independence. But the king was going to delay that response, so we said, okay, well, in the meantime, we have to defend ourselves. So the other thing that they do is they appoint George Washington to lead the Continental Army. And the reason why it was George Washington is a number of reasons. Primarily, this war was being fought in the North, and George Washington was from Virginia. And so they thought that George Washington would be a unifying figure because it would be a Southerner fighting a Northern war, which shows that it's a war for everyone. The other thing was that even though George Washington was very rich, he married into wealth. He was actually born a commoner. And so he was what we call the common aristocrat. Everyone liked him. The commoners understood him, but the wealthy admired him because he was a well-decorated general. People wanted to speak to him. He was well-spoken. And so he was a unifying figure for the American Revolution. So again, the question now is, how did we go from demanding rights to demanding independence? Well, the first is deaths. So many people had already died. And so can you honestly say, okay, well, we know that 30,000 people are dead, but I think it's still okay if we just went back to the way things were. I mean, how do you justify those people's deaths by just going back to status quo? You couldn't. They had to have died for something, and I don't think they died to still be ruled by an English king. The other reason that they started to promote independence was because of this guy, Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense, which pretty much made the argument that it made no sense that a monarchy ruled over a democracy, that a small island ruled over a massive continent, that an island 3,000 miles away governed our societies. Why should a king be in charge of a democracy? It doesn't make sense. So he made these very clear arguments about why, again, we should be independent. So Thomas Paine, T-Paine, writes a book, the kids like that, about how we should just break away. So eventually, we write the Declaration of Independence, which is pretty cool, and that's issued, and we have independence now. Let's see if this will work. Here's another video that I do like to show. This video hopefully you guys can hear it from there. It's awesome because the kids just love it, and actually the lyrics are great. So if you're in a middle of a lecture, that's one really good way just to break it up a bit. Is that, and it's fantastic because it's a really well done music video, and the lyrics do fit really well. And so for me, I mean, I'm a lecturer in my classroom, so I lecture the majority of the period, and we have 2-hour classes at our school because we have block schedule. But I mean, I like breaking it up with these kinds of things, and so I'm all for any multimedia that makes it more interesting and funny and exciting. I'm really big into that. The other thing that I do. With the American Revolution, actually for the Declaration of Independence, is I have this PowerPoint that I made for the Declaration of Independence, and what I do is I do it with the soundtrack to Inception, Time, and you read through it quietly, and it actually works out really well because I'm really big on drama and dramatics in my classroom. And so I like the idea of being able to sell these kinds of time periods to the kids to give them a sense of dramatic effect. Because again, most kids feel that history is pretty dead. And so we want to make sure that we make it as lively as possible. So what I do, and I'll give you guys a short snippet of this, is, let's see here. Oops. And so what I would do is I would play this. The song is pretty quiet at first, so you just start reading with within the course of human events. And then, hold on, let's skip to the... So you can imagine you're reading through which is all the political bands of which have connected them to another. And the song kind of lends itself to the next pause, the next sentence. To assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station, to which the laws of nature, nature's God entitles them. So it gives this really nice dramatic effect. And you create, again, you have this more dramatic effect of just these really awesome documents. I'll do the same with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And so if you provide music, which I think is so critical to any of these time periods, we sell movies that way, with the soundtrack. I love providing soundtracks just to any of the key moments in history. If I could, I would have my lectures so well timed that I'd have a musical soundtrack to everything. Now we're talking about French-Indian War, so the music will change as a result of that. If I can figure to get it to that point, that'd be awesome. It will never happen. But so I think that when you ever get a chance to introduce music into your classroom, it's fantastic. It really does help a lot. And then any joke videos that you guys find online are hilarious. There's this one I'll show you guys next time on a Jimmy Fallon. They talk about the Gadsden Purchase, which is not something that most people would joke about, but it's hilarious. Advantages and disadvantages of the actual war itself once it's broken out. The biggest advantage that Americans have is they're fighting home. It's a defensive war, let's put it that way. They're fighting a defensive war. They're being invaded. They're not invading, so that's much easier to win. Also, they have support from the French. Now, people, wonder, so how much of a role did the French play in this war? They played a huge role. In fact, I would argue that the French won this war with the help of the Americans and not the other way around. Because the French are the ones that provided them with weapons, clothing, shoes, food, because the British were embargoing them. So there's no way the Americans would have won without the French. But common knowledge will tell you that the Americans would defeat the British with the help of the French, but that's not by any means true at all. The French provided the Navy, the French provided the weapons, they provided the guns, they eventually provide soldiers to help train the Americans. And so really what it comes down to is the French beat the British in order to get revenge, and they said, and we might as well let the Americans help too. So they needed that local rule, that local support. The British, their advantage is they had the most powerful Navy in the world and a professional army. The Americans don't have a professional army, which means seasonally their soldiers will leave and go back to farming. Because why fight for independence when you go home and you have no food left? So you don't have a professional army in America, whereas the British do. They have a powerful Navy, and they have unlimited resources. They hire German mercenaries to fight for them, the Hessians. And so you have that going on. The weakness, of course, is the distance to battle and the fact that it's a foreign war. So that's going to be difficult for some. Key battles, as you guys know, again, Lexington and Concord, we already know, is one of the key battles. Just the beginning of the war. Another key battle you should know is the Battle of Saratoga. This is the second key battle. This is considered the turning point of the war, and this is where the French officially join the American Revolution. So the Battle of Saratoga in New York, this is where the French officially joined the war. Up until this point, they were unofficially supporting us with troops. But by the Battle of Saratoga, 1777, that's the turning point of the war, and it's where America begins to actually start winning significantly, because they convinced the French that maybe we can actually win this. And the last battle is the Battle of Yorktown, where the British surrender. When you end up teaching this class, it's up to you to decide how much military history you're going to cover. I don't cover very much. I'm not a military historian. I always tell them, if you want to learn about military history, go watch the History Channel or the Military Channel. But I'm not a big fan of it. I mean, it's cool and it's interesting and whatever else, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not good use of their time, because there's so much more that they have to cover. And so, I mean, the way I teach it gives kids the impression that we fought it over a month. But the American Revolution took over 7 years. And so I just tell them, yeah, I know that we just covered this in like 10 minutes, but the reality is the American Revolution did last 7 years. It was a very long war. It was longer than the Civil War. And so from 1776 to 1783, the war was fought. And it was a very, very long war. In any case, the war ends with the Treaty of Paris. And yeah. One of the things that the British give us is this territory in red called the Northwest Territory. The idea was that, look, the Americans are already here, and the British own the rest of the Americas, like Canada and other parts, so we figured we'll give the Americans a Northwest Territory to allow them to expand to prevent any further war. So we said, look, we'll give you this land so that you can expand, and you don't have to, we don't have to fight again in the future. So this way, we're going to give you this land, just don't touch Canada. Canada is ours. And so this is one way to appease the war and to end it pretty quickly. And yeah, that's the American Revolution in Unit 2. Well, not yet. Unit 2 ends with Articles of Confederation. Any questions about the American Revolution?
For the reasons for independence,
Mhm.
we say that so many people had already died.
Yeah.
So 30,000 people. Was this with the Lexington?
There were several other battles after that.
Or-
Yeah, so if you look at the map, which map was I using? Yeah, if you look at the map from this point on, you'll notice that there was already several battles thereafter, and so it's really just from all those deaths from all across. Again, all these battles are being fought simultaneously throughout the country, and so while you have battles being fought down here and here and here, those total deaths, we had to argue, so why are we really doing this? I mean, did we fight all of this just to say, okay, sorry, let's go back to the way things were?
And were these battles before the Continental Congress had established an army?
No, these were happening. We already established the army. Well, what happened was that we were already fighting the British. The Bostonians were already fighting the British long before the Continental Congress was established. And so we said, should we create a formal army to actually defend ourselves if they attack New York, whatever else? With the creation of that formal army, the British got more aggressive because they said, okay, not only is it a rebellion, but now you're creating a formal army now. So the battle got more fierce. And after we created the formal army, we did begin to send generals out, and it became more.
So then before the formal army, it was just more like just kind of rebellion.
Yes, it was like the Minutemen, local militias were fighting against the British here and there. There are pockets, and mostly again in Massachusetts. And because the other colonies were like, nope, not going to touch it. We'll see how this pans out. But when we realized that the British were not going to give up, and then we began to defend it under George Washington, we realized that this is going to be a colonial war, not simply just a Massachusetts war.
Okay. But as far as when we count as like the 7-year war, when does that period begin? Do we count that period as the initial battles?
Yeah, we begin we start counting the actual revolution from 1776 until a 1783. We consider that as part of that time period, primarily just because that's where we officially declared independence.
Okay.
Now,
So
whether
from when we officially declared independence until the peace treaty.
Yeah, of the Treaty of Paris. That's what we consider to be the actual War of Independence. But if you want to include all the deaths, you would include the Boston Massacre. You would include all of those as well that happened as a result. The Vice Admiralty Courts, or the people who were in prison and died in prison, they would include them as well in that toll of numbers. The people that tried to expand west via past the Proclamation, and they were killed by British soldiers for trying to expand when they weren't allowed to. You'd include those in the death toll. So all that numbers culminated into why are we still fighting for our rights back when clearly they've killed our people already.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, that's that. Let's talk about the Constitution and Articles of Confederation, and I think we'll be good. Okay, so we have this new government, and the new government that we have will be something called the Articles of Confederation. This government was made intentionally weak. We don't want a strong government. And so we have 4 weaknesses, or rather 8 weaknesses. It had no president, no Supreme Court, no single currency, no army, can't regulate commerce, can't tax, and really they made it really difficult to pass laws or amend this new government. The reason why we make this government so weak, again, no president, is that we don't want a monarchy. We're afraid that if we put a president, it'll become another king. So we have no executive branch. And so that's going to make the central government really, really weak. But they said that was cool because they wanted the power not to be in the central government in Washington, but rather to be in the states. So Virginia would be strong, and Massachusetts would be strong, and Georgia would be strong. But the government of America itself would be made weak so that they wouldn't be able to take us over in the future. Secondly, no Supreme Court, because if you remember the Vice Admiralty Courts, they didn't want that to happen. There was a fear of the Vice Admiralty Courts taking away their rights, unfairly trying them. No single currency. Really the basic idea there was that they didn't want their own states' currencies, because back then there was a Virginia dollar, Massachusetts dollar, Rhode Island dollar. They didn't want to lose the power of controlling their own money to an American dollar. And so they said, no, we all get to have our own money. And there is no one American money, because then the government prints the money, the central government is now powerful. Each state wanted power over their own economies. Which, by the way, is really difficult, because imagine going to Nevada, to Las Vegas, and having to trade your California dollars for Nevada dollars. I mean, that would just be a pain in the butt. I mean, going across the world is already a pain to exchange, but imagine within our own country. That would be such a pain in the butt. No army, because of the Quartering Act, and also just because the British Army attacked us. And so what if this central government has its own army? What if they try attacking us and that they try to become a dictator? So we take away that power. We don't want them to regulate commerce or trade, because the Navigation Acts took away that power during the colonial era. Each state wants to trade on their own. So imagine England having 13 different trade policies, which each individual state. Instead of us trading as a country, we're trading as 13 different countries, which suggests that we're not unified, which suggests that we're weak, which makes other countries think, wait, I thought they fought together, but they're kind of weak. So now the British are thinking, if they're not unified, maybe we can take them back. And so that starts entering the minds of the British, that maybe we can reclaim these colonies, because they're clearly not as unified as they were 2-3 years ago. And they can't tax primarily because of the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Tea Act, whatever else. They don't want the central government to be able to tax them. Only the states can tax their own people. They don't want a central government to be able to have that power. So the reason why this is all weak is because of the colonial experience. They want to make sure there is no weak government and power remains within the states. They figure that's the best way to safeguard their rights, safeguard their culture, safeguard their freedoms, and they're going to keep it that way. But this is not good. I mean, having a government this weak is not going to be ideal, and there will be some problems. The successes of this government, though, is they create something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So the one key success, or one of the key successes of this new government, though, the Articles of Confederation, this pre-constitution, before we have our second constitution. The Articles of Confederation's major success was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And what the Northwest Ordinance did was it created the process of making new states. So remember that territory we got from the British? Well, we couldn't just say, oh, well, let's just make those into states. The question was how. And so this created the process of making new states, which is still the same process we use today. This is in 1787. Alaska became a state this way, California, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona. They all became states under the same process. They also organized this territory, so you can see here they divided into like 6 square acre plots. So it wasn't just randomly people saying that's mine and that's mine and that's mine. You bought it by the acre, you bought it by the square mile, so it was organized, it wasn't just haphazard and random. And so they organized this territory to make it easier to settle. So that was pretty much its major success. I would say that its other success was that it served as a stepping stone to the Constitution. We started off as weak. We realized that weak was not good, so that we could have a strong Constitution. It served as a stepping stone because it did fail. Another way I like to describe it is that it was a successful failed experiment. Because yes, it failed, but we learned why it failed and we could improve upon that. So it was a successful failed experiment. So what ends up happening is that we meet at the Annapolis Convention. And at the Annapolis Convention, we discuss making the article stronger. At the Annapolis Convention, we discuss improving the articles and making it a stronger government. The problem is not enough people show up because we need all 13 states to show up in order to change the document, and only 5 arrive, which means we can't do anything. So they say, well, at least we met, and at least we know that some people are interested. We'll try meeting in 1787 in Philadelphia, and we'll meet again later. So, again, the goal is to revise it, not make a constitution yet, just revise the old constitution. In the meantime, between this convention and the next one where we do have a constitution that's developed, we have something called Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion is pretty much a rebellion in Massachusetts of debt-ridden farmers that are frustrated that they're paying taxes even though they have no money. And so they rebel. And it takes the government 3 weeks to put down this rebellion of 300 troops, or 300 revelers, which is ridiculous, because a strong government would not have to take 3 weeks to put down a rebellion like this. It should take 3 hours, 3 days, tops. But because we were unable to put down Shays' Rebellion and it threatened to overthrow our government, we realized what this shows, the significance of Shays' Rebellion, is it showed that the Articles of Confederation government was weak. We couldn't put it down. And so we realized, okay, well, maybe we should revise the article. Maybe we should give ourselves an army. Maybe we should reconsider some of our policies because we really struggled with this, and we shouldn't have. Because what happened was that Massachusetts was fighting it, and the other states refused to send militia. Like, that's your problem, Massachusetts. You deal with it. And then once the rebellion spread, like, oh, okay, we'll send our people also because it might spill over into our borders. But again, that's horrible. If there's a police chase in LA County and it spreads to San Bernardino, everybody's gonna be like, oh, screw it, it's not our problem. We're not gonna chase that guy. He didn't rob from us. And so that's not okay. And so what ends up happening is in 1787 we have the Philadelphia Convention. And at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, we meet to discuss revising the Articles of Confederation. Again, the purpose was to, again, make the articles stronger. But what we realized was, wow, we'd have to change everything to make this government stronger. So rather than, again, continuing to revise it, we decided just to replace the entire document and create a new constitution. Which, by the way, no one knew this is what we were doing. We kept this completely secret. We locked all the doors and we said, no one tell anybody what we're doing in here. This is a secret. Because if the people found out what we were doing, they would be pissed. So we tell no one. And in secret for over the summer there, they decided to create the new Constitution. James Madison here is considered the father of the Constitution because he actually did his homework before he came. He read the Enlightenment philosophers, he took notes, he brought books with him. He was by far the most educated attending the Constitutional Convention. Everyone else was just like, oh, we'll just come here and meet. But he knew that there was going to be a lot of work done here. Thomas Jefferson is not here, by the way. People assume that Thomas Jefferson attended, but he was in France. He was an ambassador at the time. So a few things emerged. The first debate, there's a lot of debate and a lot of conflict that occurs. The first debate is over how we represent the states. How are states going to be represented in the government? So Virginia proposes a plan called the Virginia Plan, which suggests that states will be represented in Congress based on what? How will we give Virginia representation, or all states representation?
Size.
Or population, yeah.
Population.
So they say we want representation based on population, because that's fair. Every state will have, a fair amount to represent their citizens, and that'll be great for us big states. And they love that because that gives Virginia, Massachusetts a lot more power. But New Jersey's like, whoa, 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 that's not fair. We are a tiny state. Our population is very small. We would have no power in this new government. So we want representation based on what? Well, what kind of representation do they want?
Based on like their portion of their state.
Yeah, they want equal
Equal, yeah.
representation. They want equal representation. You have proportional or based on population, and they have equal representation. And this debate took up the majority of the first part of this Constitution, convention, because they couldn't decide what it was going to be. So they finally came to what becomes known as the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise. And they decide that they're going to have both of these. And so the House of Representatives was created based on proportion or population, and the Senate was created based on equal, which is why there are states today that have 2 senators but only 1 representative, because they get 1. And this is also one of the major reasons why many states don't want Puerto Rico to become a state, because that would actually take away votes from some states. Specifically California. California really does not want Puerto Rico to become a state, despite it being like a great Latino population. Like, Latino population wants it to be. But the states, they don't want Puerto Rico to become a state, because that'll take away a significant amount of their power and influence. So there's that. The California currently has 55 representatives, and a lot of that would be taken away. Cool.
The House of Representatives is by size.
By population,
By
correct.
population, and then the Senate is just
Equal.
equal.
2 per.
Two,
Yep.
2 per. Right.
Mhm. And again, that changes every 10 years with the census.
Right.
The other compromise made is the 3/5 compromise, arguing that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person. The reason why is that Southerners wanted the vote to count and give them more they wanted more population power. Because again, if you count 3/5 of a person, obviously that would give the Southerners more votes, because actually their populations were very small. And so they want to count their slaves to be able to pad their numbers and give them more political power. The Northerners were okay with this, provided that it didn't count just for population. It also counted towards taxes. So fine, but you also have to pay the taxes on that extra population. And so that becomes part of it. And it's really the way we look at it is for every 5 slaves, they counted as 3 votes. That's really how it worked. It didn't mean that they got to vote, though, which is the messed up part. It just meant they counted as 3/5 of a person for population. We also decided that we would not ban the slave trade for 20 years. This is called the Slave Trade Compromise. We said we would not ban the slave trade for 20 years. This does not mean we were going to end slavery. It just meant after 20 years, for 20 years, we would not ban the importation of slaves. After that, Congress could consider banning the importation of slaves, but not until then. So again, Slave Trade Compromise, they said they would not ban the importation of slaves for 20 years. Then, 20 years later, they banned the importation of slaves in 1807. And then we also compromise and we create the Electoral College. The Electoral College. The basic idea behind the Electoral College, as you guys know, is that the people don't actually elect the president. The Electoral College does. And the reason why we created this is that back then we did not trust the people. So this was actually intended to, the term that we like to use, to curb the excesses of the masses, is a term that's commonly used. But pretty much what we mean is that we did not trust the uneducated public to make these really important decisions. And so again, this was supposed to check the uneducated public. They would elect people that they thought would be good electors, and then these electors would elect the president for them. Like, oh, I think I know what the people want. So elect me, and I will elect the next president. And of course, we have Supreme Court justices that we nominated. created that will be appointed for life. The idea being we want these people to not be influenced by social trends, that they should live by the Constitution, what's intended by the Constitution, the spirit of the Constitution, and not necessarily what is just popular. What was the intended meaning of this Constitution? Understanding the Constitution is a flexible document that breathes and lives and whatever else. How do we add to the polity of the Constitution without bowing just to whims of that public at that time? Which I would say throughout history they've failed to do from time to time. It kind of just depends. But yeah, that's that. Eventually, two groups emerged to debate the ratification of the Constitution. Once the Constitution is done being written, we now have to debate, well, should we ratify it or not? Ratifying meaning to approve it. The group that is for ratification are the Federalists. The Federalists are in favor of the Constitution because they believe it's strong and it'll maintain a good government for America. They support this Constitution via the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are a series of essays that they publish in New York in support of the Constitution. Again, the Federalist Papers by the Federalists. The key Federalists include James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. The Anti-Federalists, they don't support the Constitution. They feel that it takes away, or it doesn't protect enough of our rights. So in order to make sure that the Anti-Federalists support this new Constitution, we promise to include what that we say will protect our individual rights.
Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights, good. So the Bill of Rights is included to appease the Anti-Federalists, and the Constitution gets adopted. And we have all that stuff, and we're good to go. And then that's the Constitution. Again, things to remember. The Constitution did not give women or blacks the right to vote, neither did the Declaration of Independence. So when we look at both of these documents, and again, you can ask your students, so how radical or conservative were these two documents? Were they like out of this world, or were they pretty normal, or pretty conservative? And I think you can argue that they were radical in a historical sense, like, well, we've never broken away and declared independence before, we've never established a political government, that's pretty cool. But in terms of being conservative socially, we didn't give blacks freedom, we didn't give women the right to vote, we didn't do it in either document, Native Americans probably lost more, and there was no redistribution of wealth. No, the rich were still rich and the poor were still poor. And so these documents are very conservative socially, but politically radical. Very radical politically, new ideas, but they didn't change the landscape of American society. Things were still pretty bad. Not bad, but things were still pretty status quo-ish. And yeah, that's parts of early America, units 1 and 2. So again, I see that you already have the AMSCO book. If you want a digital copy, again, I'll email it to you guys today, and you can read it on your phones whenever you're waiting in line or whatever. But I do personally like I like physical copies of books, but if not, I'll email you guys that link today. Before you guys leave, let me give you this real quick. In order to study for these tests, it's kind of hard, and you kind of assume you have to know everything, but that's not necessarily true. What you guys do have to know is this. These are the state standards of what students have to know. Pretty much, if you can go through those standards and answer each of those in like a sentence or 2 or 3, then you should be fine for this test. But that's specifically what you guys have to know. If you guys can answer all of those questions, you'll be fine. But my recommendation is you find out what you should be studying first. By saying like section 1, you read through section 1 real quick, read over the questions, and then read the book. And then when you're done reading the book, see if you can go back and answer those questions.
And you said the book was, you said AMCO?
AMSCO.
AMSCO.
AMSCO. You can go to amscopub.org. Let me show you.
You might have sent us a link. Was that world history?
I may have. Okay, so I sent out a world history link already, but I'll send all of that out, and then I'll also send out a U.S. history link. So I'll send them out separately, and I'll include a copy of that book. And I'll also include a link. But if you go to amscopub.org, if you go to the price list and book information, or the book purchase books. Actually, you know what? Just look up R785P. That's the code for the book. I've used this book so many times, I know what the code is. And then you can decide to get the book right there. So R785P. You can just buy it online. There. And otherwise, you can also, I'll email you guys the copy of it. But yeah, use these standards. These are pretty good. I'll make sure I have a copy of the World History Standards for you guys next week as well on Wednesday. That way you guys can start doing some backwards review as well. And yeah, was this helpful for you guys today?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So again, like I said, as awesome it is for you guys to come to these classes, you guys definitely have to do a lot of independent study. I will have people at the very last week, and I'll ask them, have you started studying it? And they will say, no. Well, that's crazy, guys. You really have to start studying. So create a schedule for yourself. Look at, you have, again, if you're taking 2, then at least decide, okay, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to do focus on U.S. history only, and I'm going to read through that entire book. And then after that, I'm going to spend the next time reading over all of civics and econ. But you really have to create a schedule for yourself that makes sense. And if you're going to do just 1, then you divide it over the 1. If you're going to do 2, then divide your schedule over the next 2, over the 2 subjects. But again, you can't not study for this. The people that come back that don't pass, like, well, did you study? And I'm like, no. Well, then what were you expecting from me? I mean, I'm not a magician. But yeah, I'll see you guys on Wednesday, 5:30, and then I will continue from there. Cool. Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.